Good evening and welcome to The Right Side, the show where we talk about today's news, views, trends, and opinions from an admittedly conservative perspective. I'm your host, Chris Pareja, and this evening we're joined by Mark Mix of National Right to Work, and we're going to talk about crazy things such as people being able to choose to join a company or an organization and choose whether or not to pay union dues. Revolutionary types of thoughts. Mark, welcome to the show.
Chris, good to be with you. Thanks for the opportunity.
So, this heresy, or the heresy that we're talking about here, and things that are totally countercultural in California, not being able to force people to join unions and pay dues. How did you get involved in such crazy topics as this?
Yeah, well, first of all, the good news is it's very, very simple. And in my limited imagination and mind, I need to take on simple things, Chris. So right to work is a really simple concept. It is, we believe that everyone should have the right to join a union, but no one should be compelled as a condition of employment to pay dues or fees to get or keep a job in America. You know, in a country that was founded on this grand idea of self-government and individual freedom, it's amazing to me and to literally millions of others to think that you can be forced to pay a private organization money in order to work in America. That's an outrage. And when I learned about that, I came from a union household. My stepfather was a 32-year member of the International Association of Machinists. My mother washed dishes in a school cafeteria, was a union member. My brother's a fourth grade teacher in the New York school system. He has to pay union fees. I wouldn't have thought this would be a big issue until I finally got involved back in 1986 is when I started with Right to Work.
And we've moved past just unions to forcing people to buy things like healthcare, as an example. So, I mean, we're getting more and more down that road. But you're actually trying to turn back the tide in the things that you're doing and put more control back in the hands of the workers themselves.
Absolutely. You know, the ultimate battle here over right to work is really between workers and union officials. They want to make you believe that somehow big business has something to do with it. But the real theory behind right to work is that union officials oppose it because if, Chris, workers had a right to choose whether or not they wanted to financially support a labor union, they might choose otherwise. And so union officials have to keep them corralled in this collective. It's been that way since 1935 when we passed our federal labor policy under the Roosevelt administration that basically nationalized America's labor policy. And ever since 1935, union officials have had a dramatic ability to not only to force you into collectives, but also force you to pay for, quote, the privilege.
Right, and so when you're talking about giving people a choice over paying dues or not paying dues, is there a capability of paying for part of things? So you could actually pay for the benefits that you're getting from the union, but not necessarily the political aspects of things that you may or may not agree with.
Yeah, under current law, Chris, there is relief for workers that are compelled to pay fees, but it's not real relief because here's what happens under American labor law. And the cases that are on point, both in the private sector and the government sector, are National Right to Work Foundation cases litigated at the U.S. Supreme Court. The first one in the private sector was a case called Beck versus Communication Workers of America. A telephone lineman worked for the old Bell Atlantic Company on the East Coast, came to us and said, I don't like the fact that my union is using my money to support a political candidate which I oppose. We took the case, we went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. In 1988, the Supreme Court said that Mr. Beck, Harry Beck, could get relief. He could still be forced to pay something to the union, but he couldn't be forced to pay for the ideological or political work of the union. The problem with that, Chris, is that you have two choices. One, in order to protect your workplace rights, to vote on a contract that governs your employment, to vote in union elections that determines who leads the union, to be involved in any kind of union activity, you have to be a member of the union. So you have to pay full dues. But in order to protect your political rights, you have to resign from the union. You still have to pay fees, but you can't vote on the contract. You can't vote in union elections. You can't participate in any union activity in the workplace. So on one choice, to protect your political rights, you give up your workplace rights. To maintain your workplace rights, you give up your political rights. That's not a choice any worker should have to make.
Well, that's the job level kind of manifestation of taxation without representation.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and union officials talk about it that way. They say, well, you know, you can't just avoid paying your taxes, even if you disagree with it. The one thing they don't understand is that that's government. Government is a monopolistic force that we agree to. We don't agree to monopolistic forces in the private sector like organized labor. They are not government. They are private organizations. They are private small businesses that have a revenue desire, and that revenue desire comes from government power that allows them to force a worker to pay dues or fees in order to work.
Right.
Yeah.
And so talk to us a little bit about the things that you get involved in. You talked about these being cases that National Right to Work is involved in. Talk to us about maybe one of the, or talk about the top 3 that you're working on right now.
Yeah, a couple of them. One, just on June 30th of this year, the Supreme Court issued a decision in a case called Harris v. Quinn. It was the same day they issued the the Hobby Lobby case, so we got about 15 minutes worth of fame. It was one of the 2 cases left on that final day of the term. And Harris v. Quinn was a very interesting case, Chris. It started in Illinois. 8 mothers and family members came to us after Rod Blagojevich, who was then the governor, now in federal prison.
That's how they work in Illinois, right? Mayor, governor, prisoner.
Something like that. Yeah. Public housing. It's all public housing all the way. But so these people, Rod Blagojevich signs an executive order that allows the Service Employees International Union to skim off some of the Medicaid money that was being used to fund for the care of these adult children who were disabled. The state of Illinois has a program where they try to keep the child in the home, and they get a stipend to pay for their care. Well, many families take care of their own children, and in the case of our 8 plaintiffs, they all took care of family members. Pam Harris, who's the namesake in the case, takes care of her son Joshua, who's 25 years old. He's developmentally disabled. He gets a stipend, and they were trying to force Pam to pay a fee to take care of her own child. 3 of our 8 plaintiffs were actually being forced at the time to pay a fee of about $800 a year. Susie Watts was taking care of her daughter in her home. She had money taken out of her Medicaid stipend for the care of the daughter and sent right to the SEIU so they could, quote, lobby for her and be her spokesman. She never asked for it, never voted for it, never wanted it, but yet she was compelled to pay these fees. And the context in which Illinois did this was they said, okay, these people, we're going to call them public employees. We're going to call them employees of the government, but we're not going to give them any benefits. We're not going to give them vacation pay or retirement programs. We're just going to call them state employees so we can collect these fees from them.
Yes.
Well, the case went to the 7th Circuit. We lost in the 7th Circuit. We appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. And on January 21st of this year, we argued the case in front of the court. On June 30th, they agreed with us that these people were not employees and therefore couldn't be forced to pay this fee. The impact of this case, Chris, we believe at this point is going to affect health care and personal care providers in 14 states, 350,000 right here in California.
I was going to say, this doesn't just happen in Illinois. California has its own flavor of this very same situation where in-home health services people are required to pay union dues to care for family members or others.
It actually started here. It was a Gray Davis project way back in, what would that have been, 1994, 95, something like that. It kind of started here and it rolled across the country, and it was a continued kind of emphasis on these non-traditional workers that union officials are looking for dues money. Right. I mean, they've lost the manufacturing base in America.
They're trying to do babysitters and things now, right?
Yeah, exactly. And they're, and workers at fast food stores and college football players and some of these non-traditional areas of employment that they would have never been involved in before, because frankly, the business model has been really hard-pressed in the private sector.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Partially because of these kinds of philosophies pushing jobs other places in the country that don't have these problems.
That's right. The automotive industry is a great example of that, Chris. Right now, if you look at the totality of the automotive industry in America, 72% of every automobile manufactured, every original equipment part manufactured, is manufactured in right-to-work states. States that will not compel anyone to pay dues or fees in order to keep a job. That costs California jobs, frankly.
Yes. Yeah. And other places like Detroit and others who thought they had a captive market, and now people have gone where they have choices.
That's right. That's right. Another case that you might find interesting is a case called Knox versus SEIU, which we litigated from here in California. Back in 2005, you may remember that Governor Schwarzenegger put up several ballot propositions that would have curtailed union power over government workers. Well, the government unions told the state to deduct a political action fee from every state worker, even non-members of the union, and put it into a political slush fund that was used to fund the opposition to these ballot propositions. Well, several employees came to us at the foundation. We argued that case. We won it at the district court level in the Ninth Circuit. Of course, we lost in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. No surprise there. Nothing to see here, just move along. We appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, and in 2012, the Supreme Court ruled that these workers could not be forced to pay for any of these special assessments that were demanded by the union officials for non-members. So we freed something like 42,000 ended up being in the class of California workers that were freed from the ability of unions to take this money and use it specifically for political purposes.
Even people who aren't members.
That's right. Even the non-members were forced to pay this fee, this special assessment.
Because the non-members all voted that that's what they wanted to do.
Well, yeah, no, they didn't. But, to your point, Chris, that's the one thing that's really the injustice here is this forced political conformity that comes with forced unionism. I mean, how is it that I can force you to let me speak for you without your consent? In common law, we have elements of a contract that we teach us in Business Law 101. It's, consideration, meeting of the minds, no duress, and it must be legal. Those are the 4 elements of a contract. In labor law, I can bind you, I can speak for you without your consent, I can force you to pay money, there's no meeting of the minds, and frankly, we believe it should be illegal. So it violates every element of a regular contract, and labor law stands that agency relationship on its head by forcing you to accept me as your quote, agent without your consent.
And if you, as my self-assigned agent, feel that I should comply and I don't, I can actually physically beat the bejeebers out of you until you get to that point where you agree.
Well, that's probably right, but there's an interesting point about that too, and this is another special privilege that organized labor has. We have a bill in Congress called the Freedom from Union Violence Act, and you're not going to believe this. This comes from the you can't make this up category, Chris. Union officials in America have an exemption under federal racketeering and extortion laws for, quote, acts of violence that are used to achieve legitimate union objectives. So union officials who go out and say, we're on strike over more wages, and they use violence and they coordinate these campaigns, can't be prosecuted like you and I could be under federal law if we got together and tried to extort or racketeer some property from somebody else. Union officials are exempt from that under federal law.
And so you're trying to change that as well, only because it makes complete sense.
Yeah, it comes, the decision comes from a Supreme Court decision called Edmunds in 1973. It came out of a violent case in Louisiana where union officials were shooting out electric transformers and as part of their strategy to win concessions at the bargaining table. And the Supreme Court said literally because they were trying to achieve legitimate union objectives, there could be no racketeering or extortion case brought against them under federal law. And since that time, it's almost been a get out of jail free card. In fact, we have a union right now in Philadelphia that's using that as a defense after they burned up a construction site, destroyed construction property, threatened workers. They're using Edmunds as a defense saying you can't prosecute us for this because we're trying to get, union objectives. The judge in the case, interestingly enough, said, well, you're going after a non-union company so you can be prosecuted. But if you were going after a unionized company, we wouldn't have a case.
And so there's no reason at all for union companies to want to prevent this kind of thing, right?
Yeah, it's really a scary situation, and the picket lines, it's not like the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s where there's a lot more violence in the workplace, but it's still out there. And the fact that they have this federal preemption from the law gives them an extra incentive, if you will, to go out and say, yeah, we can do some of these things as long as we're asking for legitimate union objectives.
Yeah, it's like you said, can't make these things up.
Yeah.
So what else are you working on at National Right to Work?
Well, we are very interested in passing state right to work laws. We'd like to ultimately change the federal policy of labor policy that allows union officials to have workers fired. But we're working kind of a dual track. We can work at the states and we can work at the federal level. In the states, we've had a couple of good years. We passed a right to work law in Indiana in 2012. We passed a right to work law in Michigan in 2012. So there are now 24 states that make it illegal to force anyone to pay dues or fees in order to keep a job. On the national level, we have what's known as a national right to work law, and I know there's folks that get anxious about that, but our bill would not add a single word to federal law. Believe it or not, Chris, it's a one-page bill. You can read it in 30 seconds.
What kind of credibility does that have? It's got to be 43 pounds to be a law.
If it's not 2,300 pages, no one will believe that it's worth anything, right? It's one page, and we simply go into the federal law that was passed in 1935, and we repeal the provisions that authorize this compulsion. And by taking those pieces out of the law, we can actually put the bias in federal law in favor of voluntary unionism instead of compulsory unionism. One thing that's interesting in California is that no private sector worker in California is forced by California statute to pay dues or fees. It comes from the federal government, and union officials use that federal authorization to force California private sector workers to pay dues and fees as a condition of getting a job.
Wow.
Yeah.
And so I know it's early in the game with some of these things only being 2012 or so, but have you seen any of the ramifications of these laws being put into place, and has it helped the economies in those states? Yeah,
that's a great question, and we absolutely have. I already mentioned the auto industry and the dramatic shift from compulsory unionism states to right-to-work states. That's demonstrable evidence that companies looking to expand or relocate will only look at states that have right-to-work laws. In fact, we know from site selection experts that go around and help companies who are going to invest time, talent, and treasure in building a facility or expanding a facility. But we know that 50%, at least 50% of all companies looking to do that will not look at states that don't have right-to-work laws. That means California's off the list.
Right.
So what we've seen in Indiana since 2008, I mean, if you take the 2008 and the financial meltdown and you look at it from there, the right-to-work states have done dramatically better, almost double the private sector job growth in forced unionism states. But that trend is even longer than just this last 5 or 6 year period. It goes back 20, 25 years, where you see the industrial and the manufacturing growth that you see is happening in right-to-work states, like BMW in South Carolina, Boeing in South Carolina.
I was going to bring up Boeing.
Yeah. They've looked at other places, and now the Boeing plant in Charleston, South Carolina, has over 6,000 workers. They're taking the 787 Dreamliner airframe there. They're increasing productivity. And all this happened when you didn't lose one job in Washington State. You know, this has been good for America, and it's been good for those folks in Charleston, certainly, and it's good for our country because we're exporting those airplanes, and that's important.
Right. And so that destroys one of the arguments of if you go there, you're automatically destroying jobs in other places, and what's wrong with you, you evil.
Yeah, that's right. And actually, Chris, they raised that issue in the Boeing case. You may not remember this. It was a fairly large story. Basically, when Boeing announced they were going to open the plant in North Charleston, they'd built it. They'd already invested like literally hundreds of millions of dollars in building the plant. About 3 weeks before it was going to open, the unions in Washington State, the Machinists Union, filed a lawsuit with the National Labor Relations Board.
Yes.
And the National Labor Relations Board General Counsel issued a complaint saying, I believe there's merit here. The remedy, if Boeing would have lost that case, is they would have not been able to manufacture aircraft at this new facility.
Right.
And so the issue there, Chris, to your point, was not one job was lost in Washington, not one. In fact, they've ramped up production there as well on this body design, the 787. They were just building a new factory, a new facility, and the Machinists Union was so worried about it, they said, we got to file a charge. And the Obama administration's general counsel there said, yeah, we think there's a problem here.
Right.
It all worked out okay, but to your point, not one job was lost in the forced unionism state of Washington State, and new jobs were created in the right-to-work state of South Carolina.
Yeah, and so this is one of those situations where government, again, was trying to pick winners and losers or punish people who were playing outside of their designated rule set, which was completely legal for Boeing to do.
Yep.
And government got it wrong again.
Yeah, that's right, and it's that heavy hand, and we see in this administration, the Obama administration, the way he's empowered the National Labor Relations Board, the way he's empowered the Department of Labor. There is not only a thumb on the scale, there is a whole hand and a whole body on that scale tipping against small businesses, wage and hour investigations, these types of things. The National Labor Relations Board just ruled, the General Counsel there just ruled that a franchisor can be jointly liable for violations of franchisees. The whole model of McDonald's, for example, Burger King, Wendy's, these franchise models where you provide the marketing support and you provide the operating model and you test these things and then they come down lower. They're saying that now if a small business franchisee in Paducah, Kentucky violates the law, you can sue the headquarters in Oak Brook, Illinois. I mean, it's going to destroy this entire small business of franchisees. But because if a franchisor is going to be liable, they're going to have to exert a lot more control over all the decisions at the local level.
Right.
And really radically change a model that's worked well for many, many small business people in America.
And you may or may not be able to answer this question, but are you able to tell us whether or not there's a huge wage differential in states that are unionized versus right to work?
Yeah, we are. And in fact, union officials make that point. That's one of their leading points about right to work laws. They'll say, well, the wages are less in right to work states. The problem with that statement is even their own research shows that's wrong, because what you do when you compare things, for example, if I'm going to compare the salary of a plumber in San Francisco to the salary of a plumber in Provo, Utah, I'm going to recognize that the plumber in San Francisco is going to make more money on an hourly basis. No question about it.
And the cost of living is considerably higher.
And that's the point. When the unions themselves adjust wages for cost of living, they find that workers in right-to-work states have more purchasing power and more disposable income than workers in forced unionism states. So it's hard for them to use that argument anymore. In fact, one union, the American Federation of Teachers, an AFL-CIO affiliate, did this study because they were trying to get a raise for California teachers. So what do? They took the California wages and they adjusted for cost of living, and they said, well, California's not doing that well. Well, what we did is we took their same metrics, adjusted for cost of living on regular wages for all workers, and we found that workers, according to their methodology in right-to-work states, had $2,300 more to spend each year.
But you're not supposed to use their own metrics that they were trying to skew for their preferred result against them. That's just evil.
Yeah. Well, once they found out that we used them, they stopped doing that research anymore. It was very interesting. But yeah, to your point.
So now just rely on our anecdotal evidence. Forget the stats, forget the figures. Even when we created them, just listen to what we say, and it's a good argument, so you should obey.
Yeah, that's right. And if you're going to compare wages, you've got to compare apples to apples. And the only way you can do that in economics is a cost of living index.
Right.
Clearly.
And so where are you seeing things trending? Are you seeing that there will be a lot more right to work in freedom for the workers, or are you seeing that there are pockets where forced unionization is getting stronger? What are you seeing out there?
I wouldn't say it's getting stronger. What we have seen, Chris, and this is an important development, particularly for California, is we're seeing those states that have the most aggressive government union sector. And I talk about Wisconsin. Many of your viewers will remember that Wisconsin had a major battle over government unionization.
Yes.
It was this Act 10 bill that Governor Walker promoted. That bill's over. Workers there have right-to-work protections now. They're still bargaining, but Wisconsin, kind of ironically, was the first state to go down that path in the mid-1950s. They were the first state to recognize government unions as representative government employees. And they're now the first state to radically go back and reform it to a large degree. I think that trend is growing as people look at the financial condition of states. I mean, you can't look at California and Illinois without saying there's a problem that's got to be addressed. And I think one of the issues that you have to address there is the legacy costs, the promises that have been made to state workers. That's the real injustice.
It is.
These promises were made to these hardworking state government officials, and they're not going to be able to keep them.
Exactly. So people have signed up for all of the benefits and their taxation, in some cases without representation, and at the same time aren't going to get the promises. Yeah,
that's really what bothers me a great deal about this, is that all these things that have been negotiated, because I think it was one government union official in California talked about, their ability to extract money from workers, use that money to elect politicians, and then sit at the other side of the table with the politicians. She said, this is pretty good when you can hire your own boss. And in California, when you elect a politician, as you've mentioned in our conversation prior to the show, a lot of that money, almost all that money goes to one particular party.
Yes.
And that party sits down with these people at the other side. They negotiate these contracts, these pension promises. And in the real time, it sounds great. Everyone looks, oh, that's fantastic. But when it comes down to how we're going to shoulder these responsibilities 10 years from now, your son Kendall, my daughters, my kids, how are they going to pay for this?
Right.
There is no answer to that.
No, but that doesn't matter. Live for today. Forget about tomorrow.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, that reality is coming home to roost here in California, no question. I mean, you've had, San Jose, you've had 3 or 4 cities that have now gone into bankruptcy, and I know pension costs are important. Detroit is no better case study for this than Detroit, Michigan.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so we've just got a couple of minutes left. As far as if you were able to wave a magic wand, because we're not forcing people with batons and other things, what kinds of quick changes would you make to shift things in the right direction?
Well, obviously the National Right to Work Act pending in the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House. I mean, we got 27 co-sponsors in the Senate, 119 in the House. That bill would change the bias in federal law to one of voluntarism versus compulsion. If we just do that and workers have a choice, then I believe it makes the union movement more accountable, probably makes them stronger ultimately because they're working to serve you and they're more interested in what's happening on the shop floor than they are in what's happening in Sacramento or Washington, D.C. Because now once your power is granted by government, you have to protect it.
Are you talking about actually advocating for the workers?
Absolutely.
Again,
absolutely.
crazy talk.
Yeah. So that would be one big thing. Secondly, we need to take a long, hard look at the unionization problem in government. I mean, everyone says that this bargaining is a right, but who are they bargaining with? How is it that we grant a private organization a position above ordinary citizens to redress their government?
And even FDR was against that.
Absolutely.
Way back when.
Absolutely.
In closing, we just have a minute left. Talk to us about how people can find out more about National Right to Work and how they can get a hold of you.
Yeah, we can be found on that great World Wide Web, that Al Gore creation, at www.nrtw.org.
Okay.
That's the Legal Defense Foundation. If you want to know about your rights in California as a government employee or a private sector employee, you can go there and find out everything you need to know about your rights in a unionized workplace in this state of California. You can go to nrtwc.org. That's the National Right to Work Committee, and you can track legislation in Washington and in state legislatures around the country. You can go there. And if you need legal help, you can call 1-800-336-3600, and you can talk to a lawyer about your rights. We do all of our legal work for free. We don't charge anybody a fee. We have 18 staff lawyers that do nothing but represent employees whose rights have been violated by compulsory unionism.
Again, crazy, but very worthwhile.
Yeah.
Mark, I appreciate your time. If you'll hold on for just a moment, we'll be back after a word from our underwriters, the Conservative Forum.
The Conservative Forum of Silicon Valley began with 20 conservatives meeting at a restaurant in November of 2003. Our mission is to promote the principles of American liberty through education. By 2012, we had grown to over 600 paid members. Our monthly meetings feature well-known and prestigious conservative speakers addressing issues that are critical to our country's very survival. This includes speakers like Victor Davis Hanson, Andrew Breitbart, David Horowitz, and many others. In addition to our monthly meetings, we sponsor a conservative local cable access TV show, The Right Side, covering today's topics. Our Constitution discussion group not only teaches the Constitution, but started our annual essay contest that awards 2 $1,000 scholarships to local high school seniors. We are a virtual clearinghouse for grassroots organizations by providing them with table space at no charge in our exhibit area. There are typically a dozen groups represented. If you are like-minded, join us at our next meeting and become motivated and empowered. Liberty, made in America.
And welcome back to The Right Side. That was a word from our underwriters, the Conservative Forum. We thank them tremendously for making the show possible, and we're actually coming up on nearly the end of our third year now, so they are greatly appreciated. But what they're best known for is their speaker series. And this evening, the reason we were able to have Mark on the show is he'll be speaking at the Forum at 432 Steerland Road here in Mountain View, about 3 or 4 minutes here from the studio. But in upcoming months, you'll find speakers such as in October, Pam Geller. She's a blogger and commentator on Islam, and that's sure to be a conversation that raises some eyebrows, but also shows people some real areas for concern. In November, on the 11th, James O'Keefe, founder of Project Veritas. A lot of his work has been out there in conservative and libertarian circles. In December, Adam Gillette, director of development and outreach for the Motion Picture Institute. And coming up in May on the 12th, Alan West, former representative from Florida, just all around advocate for all things conservative, and guy that makes way too much sense for people who don't have their knowledge base squared away correctly. So if you get a chance, please do stop by in person to watch one of the presentations at the Forum. And you can learn more at theconservativeforum.com. In closing tonight, I just want to reiterate what Mark was saying about that workers should have the right to choose whether or not they are compelled to pay union dues and properly get their representation, not only on the shop floor, but in the state and federal halls where legislation is often passed, but not necessarily to the benefit or to the opinions of all of the workers who are being taxed but not represented. Learn more about National Right to Work. Google them, find out about their YouTube channel, the Facebook, and others, and track Mark down and reach out to him with questions you may have. On that note, I do want to thank you for watching The Right Side this evening. Again, I've been your host, Chris Pareja, and we'll look forward to seeing you on the show or in person sometime soon. And in the meantime, you can also reach out to us at therightsidetv@gmail.com. Thanks for joining us, and have a great night.